Picture this, a battlefield, drenched in blood, not from swords or arrows, but from a herd of panicked pigs, set ablaze, charging into enemy lines. Or an army that builds fake soldiers out of straw just to fool a siege. Medieval warfare wasn't just brute force, it was a game of deception, terror, and mind games. Today, we're not looking at the kings or castles, but at the strange, disturbing, and brilliant tactics that won or lost wars in the most unexpected ways. Medieval warfare was not a contest of honor. It was a brutal exercise in survival, shaped more by scarcity and chaos than by rules or ideals. Commanders weren't rewarded for fairness, they were remembered for victory. And that victory, more often than not, depended on tactics that blurred the line between innovation and desperation. Few armies in medieval Europe were professional or standardized. Most forces were patchworks of conscripted peasants, minor nobles, and mercenaries. Supplies were unstable. Weapons varied by region and class. Horses were rare, and armor, if available at all, was unevenly distributed. This imbalance drove commanders to improvise. They couldn't rely on strength alone, so they relied on something else: deception, shock, terrain, fear, and anything that could be turned into an advantage. In this context, strange tactics were often the only practical choice. Leaders manipulated not just the battlefield, but the minds of their enemies. When faced with overwhelming odds, they built fake camps to exaggerate their numbers or spread false rumors to sow confusion in enemy ranks. Sometimes, the mere appearance of strength was enough to avoid battle altogether. Sieges, a cornerstone of medieval conflict, encouraged the most unorthodox strategies. Starving out a fortified town could take months. To speed things up, attackers hurled dead animals and infected corpses over the walls to breed disease. Fires were set, water sources poisoned, and psychological pressure applied day and night. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, plague-ridden bodies were catapulted into the Scythia. Tactic many historians link to the eventual spread of the Black Death across Europe. Defenders adapted in kind. Castles were designed not only for defense, but also deception. Hidden doors, false walls, and dummy guards were used to confuse attackers. Some lords staged lavish feasts on ramparts to trick besiegers into believing they had months of provisions left, when in truth they were days from starvation. Commanders also turned the environment itself into a weapon. In Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, armies lured enemies onto frozen lakes, then shattered the ice beneath them. In muddy terrain, they dug hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes. Forests were manipulated into traps, rivers diverted, and livestock weaponized. Nothing was off the table if it gave even a marginal advantage. This was not madness, it was strategy forged under pressure. Medieval warfare rewarded those who were willing to think sideways. The strange was often brilliant, and in a time where every battle could decide the fate of a kingdom, rulebooks were more likely to be burned than followed. Throughout medieval warfare, animals were more than beasts of burden or sources of food, they were weapons. When steel failed and numbers fell short, commanders turned to the natural world for shock value, chaos, and psychological impact. Some uses were grounded in logic, others in desperation. But across continents and centuries, war turned pigs, bees, rats, and elephants into instruments of terror. One of the most striking examples comes from the ancient and medieval use of war elephants. Massive, intelligent, and easily spooked, these animals could crush infantry lines and scatter cavalry. But they were also vulnerable. The Romans, confronting Pyrrhus of Epirus in the 3rd century BCE, and later Hannibal of Carthage, learned quickly that elephants, when panicked, could trample their own men. By the medieval period, tactics to counter war elephants had evolved none stranger than the use of pigs. Roman and Byzantine sources both reference the tactic. During the siege of Megara in 266 BCE, the defenders reportedly released pigs covered in pitch, set them on fire, and sent them squealing toward the Seleucid war elephants. The sound, combined with the flames, sent the elephants into a frenzy. The tactic was later recorded in the Poliassetica, a Byzantine military manual, as a method of disorienting enemy elephants during battle. The combination of fire and animal distress exploited the elephant's sensitivity to noise and unfamiliar stimuli. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Elsewhere, animals were used as living projectiles. During sieges, diseased carcasses, human and animal, were launched over walls using catapults or trebuchets. The Mongols at the siege of Kaffa in 1346 used this strategy with lethal effect, flinging plague-infected corpses into the Genoese-held city. They not only weakened the defenders but, according to some historians, may have contributed to the spread of the Black Death into Europe. It was one of the earliest documented instances of biological warfare, using rotting flesh as a contagion rather than a weapon of direct force. Bees and wasps, too, were weaponized. In Southeast Asia and parts of Europe, defenders of fortresses hurled hives over walls or dropped them into enemy trenches. The unpredictable swarms disrupted formations and inflicted panic. In Ethiopia, during the 16th century, beekeepers were purportedly enlisted to place hives near enemy camps and provoke the insects at night. The tactic didn't kill armies, but it stalled them, scattered their ranks, and exhausted morale. Rats, while not weaponized in the traditional sense, played an unintentional role in warfare. The bubonic plague spread by fleas carried on rats, decimated armies more efficiently than any sword or bow. In besieged towns, the accumulation of waste and corpses created breeding grounds for disease. Commanders, understanding this indirectly, began using corpses not just for intimidation, but for calculated infection. The manipulation of fear, contamination, and superstition became a key part of siegecraft. In some cases, animals were disguised or manipulated to appear more fearsome. Horses were painted or armored to appear demonic. Dogs were strapped with small incendiaries and sent into enemy camps at night. In rare accounts, birds were trained to carry burning materials to thatched rooftops, an imprecise tactic, but one that shows the extent to which imagination and resourcefulness defined medieval combat. These examples were not gimmicks. They were the products of commanders under extreme pressure, willing to weaponize anything with weight, sound, or movement. Animals, in this context, became extensions of fear, whether through noise, infection, or raw confusion. Their impact was not measured in clean kills, but in chaos, and chaos, in the medieval battlefield, could be the difference between collapse and survival. In the unpredictable terrain of medieval warfare, seeing wasn't always believing. Commanders learned quickly that perception could be as powerful as steel. When numbers fell short or time was scarce, deception filled the gap. Fake troops built from wood, cloth, and straw stood shoulder to shoulder with real soldiers, fooling scouts, misleading attackers, and buying time that could mean the difference between survival and slaughter. One of the earliest recorded uses of such tactics comes from the 10th century Byzantine general Leo, facing a larger Arab force in Anatolia. Phocas reportedly ordered his men to stuff tunics with straw and plant them along ridge lines. From a distance, it appeared as if the hills bristled with hidden battalions. The enemy hesitated, misjudged the size of the force, and delayed their assault. That delay gave Phocas the hours he needed to reposition and eventually rout the opposing army. These weren't isolated tricks. Medieval warfare, with its long distances and limited visibility, was built on misjudgment. Commanders exploited that. During the 100 Years' War, both English and French armies used dummy tents and scarecrow soldiers to suggest a larger presence. At the Siege of Orleans in 1812, English forces under the Earl of Salisbury used wooden effigies to keep sections of the city's defenses looking manned while concentrating their real soldiers on critical points. The ruse stretched thin resources without exposing vulnerability. In 1387, a conflict in the Iberian Peninsula between the Crown of Aragon and the Kingdom of Castile produced a more creative example. Aragonese forces, anticipating an attack but lacking manpower, erected hundreds of dummies along their walls. They lit torches behind the effigies at night and sounded horns at random intervals. Castilian scouts reported a garrison of thousands. In reality, fewer than 300 soldiers held the fortress. The illusion held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. These ghost armies weren't just physical, they were psychological. The mere idea of an unseen force, hidden in the hills or waiting in ambush, often shaped the choices of invading armies. This concept, echoed in Chinese military treatises like Sun Tzu's Art of War, found practical application across medieval Europe and the Middle East. Shadows became threats. Silence could suggest traps. A field of still figures on a moonlit night didn't need to move to do damage. Camouflage, in this era, wasn't just about hiding troops, it was about distorting reality. Forested landscapes were used to break lines of sight. Cloth dyed to match terrain was draped over siege towers. Even horses were sometimes camouflaged with mud or leaves. But the most effective trick was to control what the enemy thought they saw. These tactics reflected more than desperation. They showed tactical intelligence and a deep understanding of human perception. Deception wasn't the last resort. It was often the first line of defense. Ghost armies didn't just fill gaps in manpower. They created hesitation, shifted enemy priorities, and bought time, arguably the most valuable resource on any medieval battlefield. In a time where battles could be lost by a moment's miscalculation, the illusion of strength often proved more powerful than strength itself. Medieval fortifications were never just about stone walls and wooden gates. Behind the towering ramparts of castles and strongholds lay an entire system of defense built on misdirection, intimidation, and layered traps. Engineers and defenders didn't rely on height alone. They transformed the surrounding landscape into a weapon. Where brute force couldn't hold back invaders, clever fortification tactics stepped in. Moats, for example, served more than one purpose. Though often imagined as wide, water-filled ditches, many were dry-engineered instead to break formations and slow siege engines. In some cases, the bottom of these dry moats was lined with sharpened stakes, buried beneath a thin layer of brush or loose soil. These pits weren't visible until it was too late. One misstep, and advancing infantry found themselves impaled or immobilized. Easy targets for archers positioned above. Accounts from 13th century Europe document such defenses. At castles like Château de Gisors in Normandy, where dry moats were reportedly laced with wooden spikes in concealed holes. In Eastern Europe, Hungarian and Polish fortresses adapted similar methods, particularly during Mongol incursions, turning natural ditches into death traps. Flammable materials also became a key part of defensive architecture. Moats were sometimes filled with pitch, oil, or tar. When attackers attempted to scale the walls or place ladders, defenders would ignite these substances, engulfing the base of the wall in flames. The fortress of Shenyang in 13th century China used this method during the Mongol siege, hurling pots of burning oil from parapets while setting fire to surrounding trenches. These tactics were designed not just to repel, but to terrify, and in some places, even nature was conscripted into defense. Historical records from the Middle East and parts of Eastern Europe mention defenders throwing beehives and hornet nests at attackers. The aim wasn't mass casualties, it was confusion. Armored soldiers, trapped in tight formations, had little defense against swarms of enraged insects. The chaos disrupted ladders, siege towers, and tightly organized units, creating openings for counterattacks. Castles in the Balkans, facing frequent Ottoman raids, employed this tactic with some frequency. As documented in 15th century military chronicles, there are also accounts of castles preparing their own terrain as weapons. The fortress of Himeji in Japan was built with a maze-like approach. Path defenders used winding slopes, false gates, and narrow choke points to disorient attackers. The approach was intentionally confusing, exposing invaders to constant missile fire while sapping their momentum. Though geographically distant, this concept echoed the layered defenses of crack-day chevaliers in Syria, a crusader stronghold that used inner walls, staggered towers, and sloped bastions to create kill zones. For intruders who made it past the outer gate, not every defense relied on deception or engineering. Sometimes, defenders simply used everything within reach. Boiling water or sand was poured through murder holes. Slaked lime, which burned the eyes and lungs when dispersed, was occasionally dropped on climbing attackers. Even waste from latrines was thrown from parapets, not only as a last resort, but as a crude form of chemical deterrent. These weren't acts of desperation. They were calculated defenses designed for maximum disruption. Medieval warfare favored those who understood that a castle's strength lay not just in its walls, but in its traps, its layers, and its ability to turn every inch of ground into hostile terrain. Siege warfare in the medieval period was rarely swift. Castles and fortified cities could hold out for weeks, even months, with defenders surviving on dwindling supplies while attackers camped just beyond range, waiting for disease, hunger, or morale to break the walls from within. But some commanders grew impatient, and when brute force failed, they turned to something far more insidious: biological contamination. By the 12th century, the tactic of using rotting organic matter to weaken defenders had become increasingly documented. Animal carcasses were not merely discarded, they were collected, sometimes left to decay deliberately, and launched into besieged cities using catapults or trebuchets. The stench alone could demoralize a garrison. But worse, the decomposing matter invited vermin, disease, and decay into already cramped conditions. In 1346, during the Mongol siege of the Genoese-controlled port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, this tactic reached one of its most notorious extremes. The Mongol army, reportedly stricken by an outbreak of plague, catapulted infected corpses over the city walls in an effort to spread the disease among the defenders. Panic followed. Genoese ships fled the city and, some accounts suggest, they carried the plague back to European ports. helping ignite the Black Death that would kill over 25 million people in just a few years. This was not the only recorded use of disease as a weapon. During the siege of Tourne-Lavac in 1340, English forces under King Edward III threw dead animals into the city to poison water sources. The idea wasn't to kill directly, but to contaminate food and drinking water, force the spread of illness, and weaken the will of the defenders. Even excrement was used, stored in barrels, fermented, and launched into besieged zones. The psychological effect of these tactics was as damaging as the physical consequences. Soldiers and civilians, already under siege stress, faced the added horror of corpses raining from the sky. The presence of death inside the walls made surrender feel inevitable. No weapon strikes deeper than the belief that resistance is pointless. These tactics blurred the boundary between military strategy and deliberate cruelty, and yet they were effective. Medieval warfare had no clear rules against such actions, no Geneva Convention, no formal bans on biological contamination. Commanders did what they thought would bring victory, and in the pressure cooker of prolonged siege, morality often gave way to expedience. In using rot and filth as tools of war, medieval armies revealed a brutal calculus that fear, despair, and disease could break walls faster than any siege engine. And once released, these forces rarely stopped at the battlefield. While many medieval battles were fought in the open, the real challenge often began at the city walls. Fortifications were designed to keep armies out, but not every attacker relied on force. Some relied on disguise, misdirection, and betrayal. These tactics didn't just bypass defenses. They exploited trust, ritual, and routine. One of the most common forms of infiltration was the false surrender. During the 11th century wars in Sicily, Norman forces under Robert Guiscard approached a Muslim-held stronghold under the flag of truce. They feigned negotiations, offering peace terms and a symbolic exchange of gifts. When invited inside the gates, a small contingent of soldiers, hidden beneath cloaks, turned on the guards and opened the way for the full assault. It was swift, brutal, and effective. The garrison fell not by siege, but by trusting an offer of peace. This tactic repeated across Europe. In 1370, during the 100 Years' War, the town of Limoges fell to Edward the Black Prince after a betrayal from within. A gate was opened in the night by a disaffected resident, allowing English troops to rush in. The result was a massacre. Whether through deceit or internal dissent, breaking a city from within proved more efficient than battering it from without. In some cases, deception took the form of religious disguise. Monks and pilgrims were granted leniency at many city gates. Documents from 12th century Iberia describe cases where soldiers dressed as friars entered cities to scout defenses or smuggle in weapons. This wasn't limited to Europe. In the Islamic world, during periods of internal conflict, envoys posing as scholars or traders used their access to map city layouts and bribe key officials. These early espionage tactics blurred the line between war and diplomacy. Disguised trade convoys were another tool. In 1592, during the Japanese invasions of Korea, a group of Japanese soldiers attempted to infiltrate a walled Korean town by hiding inside grain carts. Though discovered before they could open the gate, the plan reflected a recurring pattern: use the daily rhythms of commerce as camouflage. But perhaps the most symbolic and dangerous tactic was the so-called gift ploy, drawn from the myth of the Trojan horse. Though the original tale comes from Homeric legend, Its logic was mimicked in several medieval sieges. In 1221, during the Fifth Crusade, Crusader forces attempted to gain access to the Egyptian city of Damietta by sending what appeared to be a tribute cart, loaded with warriors concealed under a cover of goods. The ruse failed, but similar attempts elsewhere did succeed. Smuggling soldiers inside barrels, hay carts, or even funeral processions wasn't unheard of. Another version of this trick involved siege ladders. During the siege of Naples in 1191, troops loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI reportedly pretended to abandon several ladders near the city walls. When Neapolitan defenders recovered and stored them, hidden attackers scaled the walls that night using the very ladders the defenders had taken in. These tactics were built on psychology. They relied on assumption, pattern, and the human tendency to lower defenses in moments of routine or ritual. In war, where even a momentary lapse could bring disaster, trust itself became a vulnerability. Medieval commanders understood that battles weren't only won on fields, they were often won in the shadows, behind cloaks, or hidden in plain sight. Not all battles were fought in daylight. Medieval warfare often favored the dark when fear multiplied and perception became unreliable. Night raids, noise tactics, and scorched earth strategies weren't about direct confrontation. They were about control, not of land, but of the enemy's mind. Night operations were among the oldest and most effective forms of psychological disruption. In 1271, during the Mongol siege of the Syrian city of Aleppo, Mongol forces staged repeated attacks just before dawn, then retreated. These weren't full assaults, but coordinated distractions. Trumpets blared, drums beat, and riders screamed into the darkness. The defenders were forced to respond each time, unable to rest, unsure when a real attack would come. Over days, exhaustion took hold, eroding readiness more than any battering ram. The Mongols mastered this technique, but they weren't alone. In 10th century England, Viking raiders frequently launched nighttime ambushes against towns along the coast. They relied on speed, unpredictability, and the chaos of darkness to terrify communities into submission before any organized defense could be mounted. The fear of sudden, unseen assault kept villagers in a constant state of unease long after the raiders were gone. Sound, used strategically, was another powerful weapon. Large armies sometimes employed coordinated drum lines or horn signals, not to communicate, but to create the illusion of greater size. During the Hussite Wars in the 15th century, Czech rebel forces used wagon-mounted drums to amplify their presence, particularly during night maneuvers. Enemies, unfamiliar with their tactics, often believed they were facing a much larger force and hesitated to engage. Rumors, too, became tools of war. Misinformation spread by spies, defectors, or even staged prisoners could destroy morale before battle even began. During the siege of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans circulated tales of divine punishment awaiting defenders. In earlier centuries, Frankish crusaders were known to exaggerate their numbers and victories when moving through foreign territory, causing towns to surrender without resistance. But the manipulation of fear didn't end with noise or rumor. It extended to the land itself. Armies routinely burned crops and destroyed water sources as they advanced. The goal wasn't just to weaken supply lines, it was to send a message. Resistance would bring starvation. In 1139, Geoffrey of Anjou's forces burned fields across Normandy not to defeat castles, but to make holding them untenable. By the time defenders realized they had no harvest left, Surrender became inevitable. Psychological tactics allowed commanders to wage war without always drawing a sword. These methods weren't about victory in combat, they were about avoiding it altogether by collapsing the enemy's will to fight. Medieval leaders who understood this could win battles before they even began. Medieval commanders understood a fundamental truth. Land could be as lethal as steel. Terrain wasn't just a backdrop to the battle, it could be the weapon itself. Armies that knew how to shape it, read it, or trap enemies in it gained an edge far more valuable than numbers. Nowhere was this more evident than in the brutal landscapes of Russia, Scandinavia, and northern France, where weather and soil were often deadlier than swords. In 1242, the frozen surface of Lake Peipus in present-day Estonia became the site of one of the most famous examples of terrain manipulation there. Prince Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod faced off against the Livonian branch of the Teutonic Knights in what became known as the Battle on the Ice. Nevsky deliberately chose the frozen lake as the battleground, anticipating the heavy cavalry of the knights would fare poorly on the brittle surface. As the battle unfolded, Russian infantry drew the knights onto the thinner parts of the ice. The weight of their armor and horses caused sections to give way. Many drowned or were cut down while struggling to regain footing. The lake, more than the blade, turned the tide further north, in the forests of Scandinavia. Commanders used thawing seasons to their advantage. Spring battles were rare not because of diplomacy, but because of mud. In Sweden and Denmark, where terrain alternated between icy crust and saturated earth, roads became impassable. But some military leaders turned this into strategy. In the mid-14th century, during a conflict between King Magnus Eriksson of Sweden and rival factions, troops destroyed dams and redirected small rivers to flood known paths of enemy movement. Cavalry became useless. Supply wagons were abandoned. Battles weren't won through bloodshed, but by immobilizing the opposition in waist-deep sludge. France, too, saw its fair share of environmental warfare. During the 100 Years' War, English forces under Edward III routinely scouted for high ground and hard soil, deliberately baiting French knights into marshy or recently ploughed fields. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, this tactic proved devastating. The French, heavily armored and densely packed, advanced across rain-soaked terrain churned into mud by previous movement. They lost balance, fell in piles, and were slaughtered. The land did what the archers began, trapping the French in a living grave. Sometimes, defenders created terrain hazards on the spot. In Slavic regions, especially during Lithuanian and Polish resistance to Teutonic incursions, locals dug hidden ditches and covered them with brush. The ground appeared stable, but infantry crossing it fell into pits lined with stakes. These traps, inexpensive and quickly built, sowed chaos and disrupted formations. They were simple, but effective. Water, too, could be turned against an enemy. In 12th century Flanders, defenders of the city of Bruges breached levees and flooded surrounding fields to halt the advance of Henry I of England. What was once farmland became a mire. Foot soldiers slowed to a crawl, siege engines couldn't be moved, and food supplies were stranded. In each case, success came not from brute strength, but from forcing the enemy to fight the terrain first and lose. These tactics demanded foresight, preparation, and deep familiarity with local geography. When executed well, the battlefield became an invisible trap, one that collapsed underfoot, or swallowed entire regiments in mud, water, or ice. In medieval warfare, the land was never neutral. It could be bent, flooded, frozen, or carved in till it chose a side. In the medieval world, faith shaped every aspect of life and death. For soldiers, war was not merely fought on fields of earth and stone. It was waged under the gaze of heaven and in the shadow of divine judgment. Leaders understood this deeply. They weaponized belief, turning superstition, relics, and omens into strategic tools that could shape morale as powerfully as any sword. During the First Crusade, Pope Urban II promised eternal salvation to any man who took up arms for the Holy Land. For tens of thousands of European peasants and knights, that pledge wasn't metaphor, it was motivation. On the march to Jerusalem, commanders routinely invoked divine will to explain every success and failure. When food was scarce or disease spread through the ranks, it was framed as a test of faith. When enemies faltered, it was proof of God's favor. This interpretation wasn't passive, was engineered. Holy relics became instruments of legitimacy. Raymond of Toulouse marched with what was claimed to be a piece of the true cross. In Antioch, during the brutal siege of 1098, a monk named Peter Bartholomew declared he had visions of St. Andrew, leading him to a buried relic, the Holy Lance, said to have pierced Christ's side. Whether it was genuine or not didn't matter. The morale boost was immediate. Crusaders, near starvation and surrounded, believed they had divine protection. Days later, they launched a desperate counterattack and broke the siege. In the east, Islamic armies also framed battles through religious destiny. Before major engagements, imams declared fatwas in support of jihad, and soldiers were promised the rewards of paradise if they fell. Ottoman sultans brought relics of the Prophet Muhammad into campaigns as symbols of legitimacy and divine sanction. Staged miracles were not uncommon. In 14th century France, during the 100 Years' War, priests aligned with royal forces declared that certain victories were foretold by heavenly suns, comets, eclipses, or unusual animal births. These events were interpreted by clerics as divine approval. Even in defeat, leaders framed disasters as the punishment of sin, redirecting blame and keeping armies loyal. Superstition wasn't limited to faith. Soldiers feared eclipses, shooting stars, and even the direction of birds in flight. Commanders sometimes timed attacks to coincide with natural phenomena. A surprise assault launched under a blood-red moon could unnerve defenders more than a full frontal charge. In 1419, Hussite leaders in Bohemia carried black banners and deliberately staged their ranks in silence before battle, playing into apocalyptic fears of the end times. This manipulation of belief was strategic. It unified armies, justified atrocities, and suppressed dissent. When men believed they were part of a divine plan, they fought with a different kind of resolve. And when leaders claimed to speak for heaven, they silenced questions with fear. In medieval warfare, power wasn't just political or military. It was theological. Commanders who mastered this could command not just troops, but the hearts and minds behind them. The tactics used by medieval armies: burning pigs, fake priests, rotting corpses, dummies on walls, may seem absurd now, even theatrical, but behind every strange act was a calculation, forged in moments when commanders had little else but instinct, fear, and pressure closing in. When survival is uncertain, logic takes a different shape. Medieval warfare didn't reward purity. It rewarded results. Strength alone couldn't guarantee victory. Resources were uneven, knowledge was limited, and the cost of failure was often fatal. Under those conditions, the line between strategy and desperation vanished. A moat full of tar a barrel packed with disease, a feast staged for spies. These were tools, practical, brutal, effective. What these tactics reveal is that human behavior, when pressed to its limits, adapts in ways that defy convention. The battlefield became a space not just for violence, but for problem-solving. Sometimes that meant engineering, sometimes deception, and often it meant turning to whatever worked: animals, superstition, terrain, even rumor. There was no rulebook. If there was, it was rewritten after every siege, every ambush, every retreat. The most successful leaders weren't always the strongest. They were the ones willing to manipulate perception, exploit fear, and bend the world around them to make the unthinkable work. The legacy of these tactics isn't just a record of strange decisions, it's a mirror. It shows what people are capable of when order collapses, when the usual tools of power aren't enough. It shows how warfare, at its core, is about adaptation, and how quickly the boundaries of morality shift when weighed against the need to survive. So what would you have done? Standing on that wall with your food gone, your men exhausted, an enemy war elephants closing in. Would you have reached for a torch? Would you have sent out the pigs? History doesn't always remember who fought the cleanest. It remembers who fought smart enough to win.